Edward Stanton constructed his existence around mastery, accuracy, and dominance. He always maintained control over his plans, that is, until a tiny hand clasped his wrist amidst the bustling crowd of the airport. He glanced down and encountered a pair of wide blue eyes, brimming not only with confusion but also with fear. "Please," the girl whispered. "Hold on tight." For the very first time, Edward found himself at a loss, unsure of what step to take next. Edward Stanton was not the kind of man who subscribed to the notion of fate. His existence was crafted through unwavering commitment, meticulous attention to detail, and strategic foresight, with each choice deliberately made to lead him toward achievement. The airport served as yet another waypoint in his meticulously organized existence, a fleeting juncture between destinations, a space where individuals arrived and departed with little more than a passing glance. He strode through the terminal, exuding his characteristic confidence, his thoughts already set on the upcoming week. A sleek private jet stood on the tarmac, poised to whisk him away to Europe for a much-needed escape. It wasn't that he required the time away, Edward never sought a respite. Yet, his assistants had pressed the matter, reminding him that even the most formidable leaders needed to recharge. He had consented, if only to quell their worries. As he neared the security checkpoint, a vibration from his phone caught his attention. He cast his eyes over the screen, perusing the most recent market reports. All unfolded as anticipated, figures climbing precisely as he had foreseen. A deal he had been meticulously crafting for months was poised for finalization, and by the time he touched down in Paris, yet another acquisition would be firmly in hand. All was well managed. Up until that moment, everything seemed fine. A delicate hand unexpectedly clasped his wrist, strong yet quivering. He stiffened reflexively, his form becoming taut at the sudden touch. Edward was a man who rarely allowed others to invade his personal space without consent. His head jerked upward, ready to retreat, to seek clarity, yet the words remained unspoken. A young girl stood in front of him. She must have been no more than 6 years old. Her straight blonde hair cascaded just beyond her shoulders, a touch tousled as though she had been in a hurry. Her bright blue eyes, reflecting his own, were wide with fear, her lips slightly parted as if she had intended to speak but faltered at the final moment. Edward scowled, surveying his surroundings. The airport buzzed with activity, a tapestry of families, business travelers, and tourists, yet she remained unseen amidst the throng. There were no anxious parents scouring the area, no security personnel hurrying to provide help. She found herself in solitude. He glanced down at her, making an effort to gentle his tone. "Do you find yourself wandering aimlessly?" The girl clutched his wrist firmly, her delicate fingers pressing into his skin. "Please," she whispered. "I need assistance." Edward's breath caught, an unfamiliar sensation coiling within him. He navigated fierce negotiations, orchestrated multi-million-dollar mergers, and managed the downfall of entire companies with unwavering composure. Yet, as he stood there, gazing into the desperate eyes of a child, he felt a stirring within him that had long been dormant. Ambiguity. He bent down a bit, bringing himself closer to her eye level, mindful to avoid any abrupt gestures. "Where might your parents be?" The young woman shook her head, her golden locks cascading into her visage. "I'm uncertain." Edward observed her intently. There was a calmness, devoid of frantic tears or desperate calls for her parents. Only dread. Subdued, measured apprehension, as though she grasped far deeper truths than one would expect from a child of her years. "May I ask what your name is?" he inquired. For the very first time, she found herself hesitating. Her brow knitted together, her lips sealing in concentration, as though she were reaching into the depths of her memory. Then, almost inaudibly, she murmured, "I don't know." Edward felt his heart race. "Your name remains a mystery to you." She shook her head once more, her delicate fingers still gripping his wrist. A sense of unease lingered in the air. This was more than a mere child straying from her guardians. This was truly remarkable. Edward meticulously orchestrated each aspect of his day, from the instant he departed his penthouse to the precise moment he would step onto his plane. Yet, within those meticulously crafted plans, he had failed to anticipate this. He let out a slow breath, deftly adjusting his cuff with the other hand. "Very well," he stated, his tone unwavering. "We will find a solution to this." The girl's grip tightened momentarily before easing just a bit, as though his words had offered her a flicker of comfort. Edward Stanton had always been skeptical of destiny. Yet, as he stood there, a lost child clinging to him as if he were her final beacon of hope, an undeniable sense washed over him that his life was on the brink of transformation in ways he could never have foreseen. Edward Stanton was not the sort of man to waver. His existence revolved around swift, resolute choices. With each deal he finalized, each negotiation he engaged in, and every strategic risk he embraced, he operated under the unwavering belief that hesitation was a pathway to failure. In the midst of a bustling airport, with a small girl clutching his wrist as if it were a lifeline, he felt an unexpected stillness wash over him, leaving him uncertain of what to do next for the first time in years. The girl appeared diminutive, delicate in her appearance yet exuding a sense of poise that felt unusual for someone so young. She remained silent, not calling for her parents, nor scanning her surroundings for a familiar face. Instead, she remained motionless, gripping him with a steadfast resolve, as though she had already concluded that he was her sole opportunity. Edward compelled himself to engage in rational thought. The initial priority was ensuring safety. A protocol would exist for lost children, ensuring a system is in place to find their parents or guardians. The solution was straightforward and entirely logical. However, as he began to head toward the closest security checkpoint, the girl hesitated. Her hold on his wrist intensified, her delicate fingers digging into his skin with unexpected force. "No," she whispered. Edward paused, casting a look down at her. "They can assist in locating your family," he stated, maintaining a steady tone. She shook her head, her golden locks swaying gently with the motion. "Negative. Kindly. Not those individuals." There was an intensity in her voice, a rawness that demanded attention, causing him to stop in his tracks. He examined her, probing her expression for the insights she withheld. "What's stopping us?" She surveyed the scene, her gaze sweeping over the throng with a mix of exhaustion and alertness, her grip on his wrist unwavering. As she faced him again, her voice was scarcely a whisper. "I doubt they're searching for me." Edward felt a knot in his stomach. He inquired gently about your parents. For just a brief moment, she paused before firmly shaking her head. "The individuals accompanying me." He squinted his eyes. "Who were those individuals?" She parted her lips as if to respond, but swiftly sealed them again, her whole form tightening with tension. It felt like a transformation had occurred within her thoughts, a subtle alert embedded deep within, preventing her from revealing too much. Edward let out a slow breath, deftly adjusting the cuff of his tailored jacket with his free hand, a gesture rooted more in habit than in need. "All right," he said, his voice dropping slightly, signaling that he wasn't ready to press her just yet. "So, what would you like me to do?" The girl swallowed hard, her hold on him steadfast. "Hold on tight." Edward found himself puzzled by the weight those words carried in his chest. He had devoted his existence to ensuring that others remained at a safe distance, carefully constructing barriers against anything that might evoke a sense of vulnerability. From a young age, he understood that forming attachments could be a risk, that emotions were capricious and fraught with peril. He had constructed barriers around himself that no one had ever penetrated. And yet, there stood this little girl, requesting from him something so straightforward, something he had never offered to anyone before, his presence, his protection. He let out a breath and gave a nod. "Understood." Her shoulders eased just a bit, enough for him to understand the extent to which she had been preparing herself for rejection. He surveyed the terminal, his thoughts racing as he contemplated his next moves. He found himself unable to remain in that moment with her forever, yet he also couldn't overlook the way she recoiled at the mere idea of being apprehended by security. If she felt fear towards those meant to be searching for her, it indicated that something was deeply amiss. He retrieved his phone, flicking through his contacts until he selected a number. The phone rang twice before a recognizable voice came through. "Greetings. James," Edward said, his tone sharp. "Please come to the airport right away. An unexpected situation has arisen." His assistant accepted his decisions without hesitation. Immediately, Edward concluded the conversation and cast his gaze upon the girl. "We will find a solution to this. However, I require your trust." After a prolonged observation, she finally nodded in understanding. "I certainly do." Edward found himself puzzled by how that single, brief sentence brought a sense of resolution within him. Yet he was certain of one thing: he wouldn't let her slip away. Edward stood with the little girl at the heart of the bustling airport terminal, his thoughts swirling through countless possibilities. His rational mind recognized that the simplest solution would be to turn her over to airport security, allow them to manage the issue, and proceed with his flight as intended. That was the action of a sensible individual. That was the logical conclusion. Yet, there was something in her hesitation, the way she clutched his wrist and wouldn't release it, and the subtle fear reflected in her bright blue eyes, that suggested this was more than just a straightforward situation of a lost child longing to be with her family. He dedicated years to honing his ability to make swift, effective choices that propelled his business forward. However, this wasn't merely a transaction. A 6-year-old girl stood beside him, gripping his sleeve as if he were her sole anchor in the world. Silence enveloped them as they stood, observing the ebb and flow of the crowd surrounding them. Her fingers had relaxed a bit, yet she still held on to his hand. Edward cast his gaze downward at her. "Are you absolutely certain that nothing comes to mind?" She paused, her lips sealing tightly as if she were struggling to release the words within her. After a prolonged pause, she gently shook her head. "I don't know," she murmured. "I believe I do. However, it seems incomplete." Edward scowled. He was familiar with the concept of memory loss triggered by trauma. He had come across it briefly, in accounts discussing instances where individuals had suppressed specific events after encountering something too intense to comprehend. Yet, he had never witnessed it in person. He lowered himself a bit, maintaining a steady tone. "Reflect on the most recent memory that comes to mind. Where have you been?" The girl's brows knitted together, and she cast her eyes down to the ground. "I found myself inside a vehicle." Edward's jaw clenched. "With whom?" She inhaled deeply, her small hands clenching into tight fists at her sides. "A gentleman and a lady. However, my mother is different. Not my father." His heartbeat accelerated just a bit. "Did they mention anything to you?" She nodded, her fingers clutching the edge of her shirt tightly. "They instructed silence. I found myself in a position of waiting. And that someone would arrive for me." Edward let out a slow breath, maintaining a calm facade, yet every instinct within him screamed that the situation was far more dire than he had first imagined. A young girl found herself surrounded by strangers, waiting for someone she couldn't recall, abandoned in the bustling chaos of an airport, her mind blank about how she arrived at that moment. This was more than merely a lost child. This was a completely different experience. Just as he was about to speak, a buzz from his pocket interrupted him. He extracted it, casting a quick look at the name displayed on the screen. "James." He responded without delay. "Let me know you're present." "He just arrived," his assistant responded. "Where might you be?" "Gate C, close to the security checkpoint." "I'll arrive in just 2 minutes." Edward concluded the conversation and turned his gaze back to the girl. "A person I have confidence in is on their way. He will assist us in resolving this matter." She gave a slight nod, remaining silent. As promised, James appeared in mere moments, his keen gaze sweeping over the surroundings until it settled on Edward and the girl. He was a person well versed in navigating intense situations, familiar with adapting to sudden shifts in plans and implementing solutions with accuracy. Yet, even James paused for the briefest moment upon seeing the child next to Edward, gripping his sleeve as if she were meant to be there. "Sir," James greeted, his tone steady yet inquisitive. Edward stood tall. "A situation has arisen." James's eyes darted back and forth between him and the girl, evaluating the situation. "I understand that. Who is this person?" "That's what we're about to discover." James nodded, his thoughts racing through various possibilities. "Let's have security review the footage to identify who she arrived with." Edward shook his head in disbelief. "She is reluctant to head to security. Given what she's shared with me, I find myself questioning the intentions of those who brought her here in search of her." James took in the information swiftly, then shifted his gaze to the girl, allowing his typically formal demeanor to soften. "May I ask what your name is?" The girl paused, casting a fleeting look at Edward before she responded. "I can't recall." James maintained his composure, yet Edward, familiar with his nuances, noticed the subtle change in his expression. "Very well," James replied thoughtfully. "What's the strategy?" Edward cast a fleeting look at the girl before shifting his gaze back to James. "We bring her along." James blinked, clearly taken aback by that response. "Excuse me, but you have a flight scheduled in 2 hours." Edward let out a breath, casting a quick look at his watch. The flight, the journey, suddenly seemed utterly trivial. He instructed to cancel it. James chose not to press him any further. He effortlessly retrieved his phone and began placing the essential calls. Edward cast his gaze downward at the girl. "We are heading to a secure location." After a prolonged examination of him, she finally nodded. In an instant, everything in his life changed. After years of adhering to a carefully crafted routine, he found himself breaking free, venturing into the realm of the unfamiliar. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he found himself free of regret. Edward had never invited anyone to his penthouse prior to this moment. His residence was a realm crafted for practicality, devoid of superfluous comforts, constructed for an individual who had no patience for unwarranted diversions. Every element within it was thoughtfully selected, featuring minimalist furnishings, sleek lines, and a palette of neutral hues. It was a sanctuary where he could reflect, create, and be free from the disturbances of the external chaos. As he entered, the little girl clinging to his sleeve, he became acutely aware of the profound emptiness that surrounded him. She paused at the threshold, her petite figure taut, her azure eyes meticulously surveying the surroundings with wariness. Unlike many children her age, she lacked the wide-eyed curiosity and immediate interest in exploration. Instead, she remained rigid, as though the act of moving deeper into the space would signify an unwelcome trespass. Edward glanced at James, who had entered behind them, his eyes quickly assessing the room with the precision of a seasoned troubleshooter. He was more than an assistant, he was Edward's closest ally, a figure who had navigated challenges that extended well beyond mere missed meetings and sudden travel adjustments. "We require information," Edward stated, his tone steady. "There must be a compelling reason behind someone leaving a child in an airport." James nodded, swiftly retrieving his phone. "I will begin with private investigators. There must be someone out there searching for her." Edward looked down at the girl, her hold on his sleeve having slackened but not entirely let go. "Do you feel a pang of hunger?" After a brief moment of uncertainty, she gave a nod. He found himself unaccustomed to posing such inquiries, much less determining how to cater to a child's needs. His kitchen saw little action, primarily filled with premium coffee, protein bars, and the sporadic meal crafted by his staff during his late work hours. He approached the fridge, pulling it open to survey its contents, only to discover that nothing within was appropriate for a 6-year-old. Without hesitation, James stepped in. I will arrange for food delivery. Edward nodded, appreciative of the swift resolution. The young woman positioned herself beside the expansive windows, gazing at the sprawling city skyline beyond. The perspective from his penthouse was one that many would find captivating, with floor-to-ceiling glass revealing the vast array of lights from downtown, embodying the vibrant energy of a city that was always alive. Yet, she appeared indifferent to it. She gazed intently, as though attempting to unravel the mystery of her surroundings and the path that lay ahead. He approached her, maintaining a gentle distance to avoid making her feel overwhelmed. Do you recall anything? She adjusted her position, her delicate fingers clutching the edge of her shirt. She softly recalled a moment spent in a car. The darkness enveloped everything. Edward observed her intently. Did you have anyone accompanying you? After a moment of uncertainty, she gave a slight nod. A gentleman and a lady. However, they were not my parents. His jaw clenched. Did they mention anything to you? Her blue eyes darted in his direction, brimming with an unsettling blend of fear and uncertainty, as if she were weighing the decision to confide in him. At last, she murmured, they instructed me to remain silent. I found myself waiting for someone to arrive. Edward took a deep breath, striving to maintain his composure. And then they abandoned you at the airport. She gave a slight nod. James, having been attentive, eased his phone down a bit. That doesn't seem like a mere act of chance, he remarked, his tone soft yet resolute. It seems orchestrated. Edward was already aware of that. He glanced back at the girl. Do you recall the place they brought you to prior to the airport? Her brow furrowed, lips pursed in a silent struggle to grasp a fleeting thought that danced just beyond her reach. Perhaps a hotel. The windows were adorned with curtains that remained closed. Edward shared a brief look with James, who was busy jotting down notes. That certainly helps to clarify things, James murmured. I will look into hotels located close to the airport. The girl's eyes fell to the ground, her fingers gripping the fabric of her shirt once more. Edward observed her intently. Can you recall your name? She paused for a moment, contemplating her next move. For a moment, he wondered if she would remain silent entirely. Yet, in a gentle murmur that barely reached his ears, she breathed, Lily. It was rather minimal. Yet, it held significance. Edward lowered himself just enough to catch her eye. Very well, Lily, he stated, his tone unwavering. Until we determine your rightful place, you will remain here. Her eyes grew a fraction larger, revealing her surprise at the unexpected response. James cast a fleeting look in his direction, choosing silence over confrontation. Lily's delicate fingers gripped the hem of her shirt once more. Are you really going to stay with me? The inquiry struck him with more force than he expected. Edward let out a slow breath. He replied with a straightforward no. I shall not. Lily regarded him intently for an extended moment before, at last, allowing her shoulders to ease ever so slightly. It lacked trust. Not at this moment. Yet, it marked the initial stride. Edward had always been a man of conviction, never wavering in his decisions. Each choice he made was intentional, every action meticulously planned. As he stood in his penthouse, observing a 6-year-old girl quietly nibbling on a sandwich at his kitchen counter, he came to the realization that this was the first time in a long while where he found himself without a clear plan. Lily remained mostly silent since her arrival. She consumed her meal with care, her delicate fingers holding the sandwich gently, as though she anticipated someone might snatch it from her grasp. Edward observed her rigid stance, her posture overly restrained for someone so young, her blue eyes flitting around the room as if she were still assessing the safety of her surroundings. He had witnessed that same demeanor in boardrooms, during negotiations where individuals faced him, uncertain of the level of trust they could place in the person seated opposite them. Yet, this was not a matter of commerce. A young girl found herself alone at an airport, forgotten and without a last name, her past a mystery, and no one in sight to take her home. James lingered a short distance away, phone in hand, scrolling through the most recent updates from the private investigators that Edward had engaged. No reports of a missing child that fit her description, he said, his voice low yet edged with worry. There haven't been any filings, no alerts, and the databases are completely empty. Edward scowled. That seems illogical. Someone needed to escort her to that place. There ought to be someone searching for her. James nodded thoughtfully, his fingers gliding over the pages of his notes. Security footage captured at the airport revealed crucial details. We are currently in the process of reviewing it, but the preliminary report indicates that she was not dropped off at the main entrance. It is believed she was abandoned close to the departure gates. No reports have been made regarding a missing child, and no adults have been observed searching for her. Edward's fingers curled more firmly around his coffee cup. They intentionally abandoned her there. James paused for a moment, then gave a slight nod. It appears to be so. Edward took a deep breath, deliberately maintaining his composure. He dedicated years to constructing a realm where challenges were addressed with unyielding precision. This was beyond the reach of a simple phone call or a meticulously crafted agreement. Here was a young soul, isolated and forsaken, and with each new discovery, the situation only deteriorated. Lily completed her meal, placing the plate down with a subtle grace. She looked up at him, anticipation flickering in her eyes, eager to discover what would unfold next. He rested against the counter, maintaining a steady tone. What are your thoughts and emotions? She paused momentarily before responding. Improved. Excellent, he remarked. For the time being, you may remain here. Until we come to a resolution on this matter. She observed him intently for an extended moment. But what if no one arrives for me? Edward sensed a constriction in his chest. She wasn't merely seeking comfort, she was bracing herself for the chance that she had been abandoned for eternity. He found himself at a loss for words, uncertain of how to make a promise he couldn't guarantee. Yet, he was certain of one thing. Should that occur, he remarked thoughtfully, we will devise an alternative. You're not isolated in this journey. Lily nodded, yet the way her eyes fell away revealed her uncertainty about trusting him just yet. James cleared his throat, glancing at his watch with a hint of impatience. I will continue to pursue our sources. In the interim, what would you like me to address regarding? He made a subtle motion toward Lily, allowing silence to fill the space with unspoken words. Edward grasped the inquiry. What was the strategy? What followed? He was completely unaware. Yet, as he observed the girl seated silently in his kitchen, he was certain of one thing. She was rooted to the spot. The following morning, Edward rose earlier than he typically did. His internal clock was calibrated for business meetings, early flights, and high-stakes negotiations, yet today felt distinct. His thoughts drifted away from work, far from the impending deals that his company was wrapping up. Rather, it was focused on the little girl who had drifted off in the guest room down the hall. He lingered in the doorway late last night, watching her for longer than he would ever confess. She nestled beneath the thick blankets, her petite figure scarcely occupying any room in the expansive bed. Her breathing was steady, yet her hand clutched the fabric of her pillow tightly, as if preparing for an impending moment. As he lingered in the kitchen, preparing his customary black coffee, it dawned on him that he was utterly unprepared for what a morning with a child in his home would entail. He adhered to a disciplined schedule, meticulously crafted for optimal productivity. Breakfast was a fleeting moment, often orchestrated by his household staff or consumed at the office in the brief interludes between meetings. However, with Lily present, that plan was no longer feasible. James walked in just as Edward was fixated on the fridge, coming to the unsettling conclusion that its contents were far from suitable for a 6-year-old. His assistant entered the kitchen, hesitating for a moment before arching an eyebrow. Are you preparing breakfast? James inquired, a hint of amusement evident in his voice. Edward let out a breath, shutting the fridge door behind him. I was contemplating it. James wore a sly grin. So. There's nothing here that she will find appealing. James gave a slight nod, his fingers swiftly reaching for his phone. I will arrange for a delivery. Edward recognized the effectiveness, yet there was an unsettling feeling that lingered within him. The girl found herself stranded at an airport, forsaken without a word of reason. At the very least, he needed to ensure she felt secure in this moment. Cancel it, he declared, pushing up the sleeves of his dress shirt with determination. I will take care of it on my own. James remained silent, yet the corners of his mouth curled into a deeper smirk. I must witness this. Edward dismissed him and concentrated on the work before him. He discovered eggs and bread, a straightforward combination to utilize. As he navigated the kitchen, cracking eggs into a pan, he noticed James observing him with an expression that suggested he was witnessing something extraordinary. Isn't there something more worthwhile for you to focus on? Edward whispered under his breath. James rested against the counter, arms crossed in a relaxed stance. This is the most impressive accomplishment I've witnessed from you in years. Just as Edward was about to reply, gentle footsteps resonated from the corridor. Lily emerged at the threshold of the kitchen, clad in the roomy t-shirt that James had gifted her the previous night. Her tousled blonde hair hinted at a night of restless slumber, and she lingered in the doorway, uncertainty etched on her face as she pondered whether she had permission to enter. Edward glanced at her, motioning toward the kitchen table. Take a seat. The morning meal is nearly prepared. She blinked, her cerulean eyes darting between him and James before tentatively approaching a chair. She remained still, her hands gently placed in her lap, observing him as he completed his cooking. As he set a plate before her, she cast her gaze downward for a brief moment, her delicate fingers gently clutching the edge. She savored the bite, mulling it over in her mind as she looked up at him. Did you create this? She inquired, as though the notion were nearly inconceivable. Edward gave a slight nod. Absolutely. She paused for a moment, then savored another bite. It's quite acceptable. James let out a derisive snort, prompting Edward to cast a sharp look in his direction before refocusing on Lily. Feel free to share if something doesn't sit right with you, he said, observing her intently. There's no need for formality. Lily gave a nonchalant shrug. I genuinely appreciate it. She savored another bite, taking her time this time. It's been so long since I can recall anyone preparing breakfast for me. Edward sensed a subtle change within him, a gentle pain he was reluctant to confront. He refrained from seeking additional details. Instead, he settled into his seat opposite her, his plate remaining untouched as he observed her with keen interest while she ate. James cleared his throat, glancing at his phone. Our team continues to investigate any cases of missing individuals. There are no new developments at this time. Lily's shoulders tightened ever so slightly at the mention of missing persons, yet she remained silent. Edward let out a breath. We will find a solution. Lily looked up at him, her blue eyes wary yet inquisitive. What happens if you choose not to? He acted without a moment's pause. In that case, you remain here. She gazed at him intently for a prolonged moment before giving a slow nod. She failed to express her gratitude. Her lips remained uncurled. Yet, for the first time, she appeared just a touch less fearful. Edward was not the kind of man to doubt his choices. He constructed a vast dominion grounded in assurance, in the ability to foresee the result even before taking a single step. As he settled into his office later that morning, poring over documents on his laptop, he noticed his mind wandering from the task at hand, an occurrence that was unusual, if not entirely unheard of. Lily occupied the adjacent room, a tranquil haven curated by James, complete with an array of books, puzzles, and a modest television. She remained silent, offering no requests, voicing no grievances, and making no noise since she completed her breakfast. That was what disturbed him the most. At this point, many children would likely be inquiring about what was to come, seeking reassurance from the nearest adult for solace. Yet Lily remained in quietude, as though she were striving to minimize her presence, as if she had already grasped that seeking anything often resulted in disillusionment. Edward let out a breath, shutting his laptop with a decisive click. He was not one to overlook issues, and this situation, whatever it may be, was not something he could simply set aside. He rose and made his way to the next room, where Lily sat cross-legged on the couch, idly flipping through the pages of a book that seemed to hold little of her attention. She glanced up when he walked in, her face a mask of neutrality, yet there was an underlying tension, as if bracing for what was to come. He rested against the doorway, arms folded across his chest. "What activities fill your day-to-day life?" She blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected question. "I'm uncertain." "You have no idea." She paused, her fingers gently resting on the edge of the book. "I tend to be quite mobile. I don't always have the opportunity to engage in the same activities." A chill took root in Edward's chest. "Your movements are frequent." She gave a slight nod. "We always moved on before we could settle in." His jaw clenched, yet he maintained a calm tone. "Who were we?" Lily's delicate fingers clutched the book with a bit more intensity. "My mother." Edward lingered in silence, yet she offered no further words. He selected his subsequent words with great precision. "And those who abandoned you at the airport." For the first time, a glimmer appeared in her expression. A fleeting glimpse of an emotion he struggled to identify, perhaps fear, or perhaps a sense of uncertainty. She gazed at the book, her fingers gliding over the page as she prepared to respond. "They were not my mother." Edward let out a slow breath, attempting to dispel the rising frustration within him. He hesitated to push her, reluctant to compel her into revealing something she wasn't prepared to share. Yet, each detail she provided only reinforced his suspicions. This situation was far more complex than merely a missing child. He approached and settled into the chair opposite her, maintaining a respectful distance to ensure she felt at ease. "We will find a solution," he stated, his tone steady yet resolute. "However, in the meantime, I would appreciate it if you could let me know if anything seems off. Should you recall something significant? Should you experience fear?" Lily gazed at him intently, as though contemplating the truth of his words. At last, she offered a subtle nod. "Understood." Edward observed her for a brief moment longer before giving a nod in response. "Excellent." She resumed flipping through the book, her posture noticeably more relaxed than it had been earlier. Just as he was about to depart, she unexpectedly broke the silence once more. "Are you returning to work now?" Edward halted, casting a look in her direction. "I was." Lily inclined her head a fraction, pondering that thought. "You're not obligated to be by my side constantly. I have the ability to be silent." Edward exhaled slowly, massaging the nape of his neck. "That misses the essence." She observed him intently. "So, what is the purpose?" He paused for a moment before responding. "You're not someone I can easily overlook, Lily." Her silence spoke volumes, as a subtle change flickered across her face, just enough for him to catch a glimpse. It was not trust, at least not at this moment. Yet perhaps, for the very first time, it marked the dawn of something profound. That evening, Edward discovered himself engaging in an unexpected act, reshaping his entire agenda for the sake of another. His existence had consistently been governed by order, by productivity, by the forthcoming transaction, the subsequent acquisition, the next move in broadening his dominion. He had always ensured that nothing disrupted that. Yet here he was, with a 6-year-old girl in his home, perched at his kitchen table, idly stirring a spoon in a bowl of soup that remained mostly untouched. She neither rejected the food nor truly connected with the meal. She appeared deep in contemplation, her blue eyes darting to the expansive windows that framed the shimmering city skyline. Edward positioned himself opposite her, observing intently. He had dedicated years to understanding others, recognizing the moments of deceit, the secrets they concealed, and the impending decisions that could alter the trajectory of a negotiation. However, Lily was not merely a transaction, and that complexity made her more elusive. He paused for a moment, savoring his drink before he began to speak. "So, you're not a fan of the soup?" She shook her head, her spoon barely rising from the bowl. "Everything is okay." That response didn't address the inquiry. She paused for a moment, then gave a slight shrug. "I'm simply not feeling very hungry right now." Edward placed his glass on the table. "Due to all that is happening." Lily gazed at him for a brief moment, then gave a subtle nod. He reclined a bit, pondering his forthcoming words. "Would you like to discuss it?" She paused once more, yet this time, she refrained from shaking her head. That was a step forward. "I simply—" She gazed at her spoon, swirling the liquid once more. "I'm uncertain about what comes next." Edward let out a breath, raking his fingers through his hair. He grasped that sentiment more profoundly than she might have known. He had constructed his whole existence on the certainty of what lay ahead, yet this. They found themselves in uncharted waters together. "What are your thoughts on what should come next?" he inquired. She took her time before responding. Instead, she gently struck her spoon against the rim of the bowl, lost in thought. "I want to know where my mom is," she finally said. Edward nodded, a subtle tension gripping his chest. That was the one thing he was unable to offer her, not at this moment. Lily added softly, "I want to know if she's okay. If she didn't come for me, I need to understand the reason behind it." Her voice held a steady cadence, yet Edward could detect the tremor of uncertainty lurking beneath, the effort she exerted to mask the fear that truly gripped her. He inclined his body just a touch. "James continues his search. He is utilizing all available resources to locate her. However, until that time comes, I prefer you not to dwell on the uncertainties. We'll sort it out when we arrive." Lily gazed up at him, her eyes probing his expression for a hint of understanding. "And what if we never achieve that?" Edward paused before responding. He understood the importance of not making commitments he couldn't guarantee. However, what he could assure her was that she would not face this journey by herself. "Then we address that as well," he stated with conviction. Lily observed him intently, her blue eyes revealing nothing, yet there was a subtle shift in her posture that suggested a hint of relaxation. She lifted her spoon and savored a delicate taste of the soup. Edward remained silent, refraining from seeking further dialogue. Yet, he remained in his seat opposite her until she completed her task. That night, after she had gone to bed, he found himself lingering outside her room, gazing at the closed door for an extended moment. For the first time in his life, his focus had transformed. He felt no remorse. This narrative transcends the mere account of a formidable individual whose existence is altered by an unforeseen obligation. It delves into the essence of change, illustrating how even the most meticulously organized lives can be disrupted by something as simple yet deeply significant as the bonds we form with one another. Edward Stanton emerges as an individual characterized by authority, affluence, and a rigid adherence to structure. He has dedicated years to crafting an empire, making choices with unwavering precision, and guaranteeing that nothing and no one can disrupt his meticulously built realm. However, once Lily steps into his world, everything transforms. The allure of this narrative lies not only in the enigma enveloping Lily, her identity, origins, and the circumstances of her abandonment, but also in how she compels Edward to grapple with an unprecedented challenge, a responsibility that defies delegation, control, or rationalization. For the first time, he encounters a dilemma that lacks a tactical fix, presenting only a deeply personal resolution. The conclusion resonates deeply, not due to Edward's instant transformation into an ideal father figure, but rather because of his decision to remain present. He decides to stand by her side, to be the person Lily can depend on, even as the truths of her past linger in ambiguity. The real resolution lies not merely in discovering the fate of Lily's mother or revealing the secrets of her past, but in the deepening connection between them, in the instant Lily begins to feel secure, and in the understanding that Edward, despite his achievements, lacked something far more significant than he ever comprehended. This narrative explores transformation, highlighting how the most surprising individuals can come into our lives and completely alter our perspectives, compelling us to recognize what is genuinely important. Edward believed he possessed it all, yet ultimately, it was neither his riches nor his influence that truly characterized him. It was the straightforward gesture of providing support when someone required it the most. And that, above all else, shaped him into the man he was destined to become.